Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. This is Milton Alimadi. As many of you know, recently I introduced a new format called We Love African History, which is a live discussion with, live interactive participants every Saturday at 12 noon. Now, I also realized that there's some topical issues that I would like to comment on. So the straight commentary does not lend itself to We Love African History, which is why a situation where I assign reading assignments and film assignments, and people have a week to digest that, and then when we get together, we have the discussion. But the straight commentary does not fit well for that format. And there is an issue I wanted to comment on, which is the film, The Woman King, which has generated some conversation. And there are aspects of it that I want to comment on, which means today's presentation will be in the old format of African History Club. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read also from what I wrote, an article I wrote for Medium on the film, The Woman King. It's a slightly amended version of the article I wrote for Medium. In addition to reading from that article, I'll also make additional comments that are not in that article itself. And the more I think about it, I've been thinking that maybe I will maintain this platform for the direct commentary that I had been making over the last 2 years, African History Club, and maybe have a completely different platform for We Love African History rather than commingling. So we'll see how that works. So I will count today's commentary as African History Club episode number 58, unrelated to We Love African History. So let me read from the amended article that I wrote for Medium, and you will be able to see why I took an interest in wanting to make a commentary on this particular film. And by the way, my brother Andrew went to Uganda and brought me this shirt and wanted me to make sure I mentioned it as well. It is a beautiful shirt. I love it. So Andrew Alimadi, thank you for bringing me the shirt from Uganda. Woman King. Critics are wrong. Dahomey Empire fought against European slavers. I loved The Woman King, which I saw recently, starring the outstanding Viola Davis with an excellent cast. The movie opened number 1 at the box office with $19 million. As of October 29, it had earned $83.5 million globally, $63.5 million domestically, eclipsing the $50 million production cost. It's about an all-female army, the Agoje, led by General Naniska, played by Davis, that guarded the Dahomey Empire during the reign of King Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1859. Some critics called for a boycott over allegations that the film glossed over Dahomey's own role in slavery. Part of this criticism could have been deflected had the film's director, Gina Prince Bythewood, included in the preface script some of the information I will now discuss. The Dahomey Kingdom fought European slavers for years under Agaja Trudeau, who was described as the empire's greatest king by the late Walter Rodney, one of the most celebrated historians of Africa. Quote, between 1724 and 1726, he looted and burned European forts and slave camps, and he reduced the trade to a mere trickle by blocking the paths leading to sources of supply in the interior. End quote. Rodney wrote of Agaja in his classic work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which celebrated its 50th year in print this year. Quote, European slave dealers were very bitter, and they tried to sponsor some African collaborators against Agaja Trudeau. Agaja was not the exception, and many African leaders, until they were weakened by the invaders' superior firearms, fought the European slavers who came searching for enslaved labor for the mines and plantations in the New World, where they were busy exterminating indigenous people considered unfit for hard labor. Matamba, in present-day Angola, resisted Portuguese slavers for decades, beginning in the 1630s, under Queen Nzinga. Portugal worked with African collaborators in neighboring territories to attack Matamba, isolating it from commerce with the outside world. In 1656, her empire diminished severely through warfare. Queen Nzinga yielded and allowed slaving. Tomba, leader of the Baga people who inhabit parts of modern Guinea, resisted European slavers in the 1720s until he too was vanquished. Quote, once trade in slaves had been started in any given part of Africa, it soon became clear that it was beyond the capacity of any single African state to change the situation. End quote. Rodney wrote. The Woman King's setting is the reign of King Gezo, beginning in 1818. The film erred by not recalling King Agaja's heroism in the 18th century. To its credit, the film does depict King Gezo's dilemma. Should he resist the deplorable slave trade, like Agaja, or face economic ruin? I suspect some of the critics have not seen the film. After I praised it in an Instagram post, a social media friend responded, quote, I'm very surprised to see that you supported this film, Professor. Are you aware of the history? Would be interested in your perspective. If so, end quote. When I asked if she had seen the film, she responded, quote, I personally cannot support the film, although I adore Viola Davis. The revisionist history the film poses is extremely problematic, end quote. There's no revisionist history. But why would some people denounce the film and presume that it wasn't transparent about Dahome's role in the enslavement of Africans? Because the role of some African leaders, the collaborators Rodney wrote about, is rarely discussed. Quote, many guilty consciences have been created by the slave trade, end quote, Rodney wrote. Quote, Europeans know that they carried on the slave trade, and Africans are aware that the trade would have been impossible if certain Africans did not cooperate with the slave ships, end quote. Even on the plantations in the New World, enslaved Africans were sometimes betrayed by collaborators, so-called house Negroes. Nat Turner, who led one of the most serious slave rebellions, was himself betrayed by enslaved Africans. In our own modern era, we have people like Ugandan dictator General Yoweri Museveni, who once told the Atlantic magazine, quote, I've never blamed whites for colonizing Africa. I've never blamed these whites for taking slaves. If you are stupid, you should be taken a slave, end quote. Museveni would have likely sided with the European slavers had he lived between the 16th and 19th century. Another question sometimes posed is whether slavery existed in Africa prior to contact with the European world. Historically, in Africa, as with other parts of the world, people vanquished in wars were subjugated. These captives became foot soldiers or engaged in other aspects of economic production, such as agriculture or artisanal production. In many African societies, the captives or their descendants became integrated into the community. Some became political or military leaders. Subjugation came from warfare. Africans did not go to inspect and purchase other Africans on auction blocks. Yes, Africans enslaved in the Arab world in North Africa and the Indian Ocean island of Zanzibar were indeed subjected to the auctions. European slavers, strictly in search of enslaved labor, introduced a strictly commercial element. With African collaborators, they sparked a new kind of war. Attacks by Africans against other Africans, strictly for the purpose of captives for Europeans. Quote, "The trade in human beings from Africa was a response to external factors," end quote. Rodney wrote, "To ignore the outside stimulus for the African slave trade, for the Atlantic slave trade, is preposterous. It would be as if, quote, without European demand, there would have been captives sitting on the beach by the millions," end quote. Rodney wrote, "The impact of slavery has been devastating to African descendants in the New World and to the African continent as well. The depopulation retarded development." Rodney notes that between 1650 and 1850, a period which overlaps the Atlantic slave trade, there was no increase in Africa's population, which remained at about 100 million. During the same time frame, Europe's increased from 103 million to 274 million, or by 166%. Asia's rose from 257 million to 656 million, or about 155%. Quote, "African economic activity was affected both directly and indirectly by population loss," Rodney wrote. And this as a result of the new slave raiding wars and the disruptions in agricultural production and dislocations. The Woman King celebration of Dahome's female soldiers could spark, or should spark, major studio interest in other epic stories from Africa. Queen Nzinga's brave anti-slavery resistance is an obvious candidate for the big screen. Another excellent project could be one which happens to be the subject of my recently completed dramatic history graphic book, Adwa, Empress Taitu and Emperor Menelik in Love and War. The book chronicles Ethiopia's March 1, 1896 victory over an invading Italian army seeking to colonize it. This was during a period referred to as the Scramble for Africa, between 1880 and 1900, when European powers, with England, France, and Belgium at the forefront, were rushing for colonies in Africa. Europe had industrialized in the previous centuries, and there was desperate demand for natural and mineral resources, cheap or slave labor to produce these products in Africa, and captive markets for Europe's factory manufactured products. The Europeans met at the Berlin Conference from November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, and divided up the African continent. Africans had no knowledge such a meeting was taking place. To take control of its designated territory, Italy prepared for war on Ethiopia. Before setting off to battle, General Oreste Baratieri, the commander, vowed to Italy's King Umberto that he would return with Menelik II in a cage. The Ethiopians, to the astonishment of European nations who did not believe an African army could defeat a white one, annihilated the Italian army in a mere 6 hours at the Battle of Adwa. Empress Tetu was one of the war heroes. She had 6,000 men under her command. The Ethiopians killed about 3,000 Italian soldiers and captured an almost equal number. They marched them back to Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, and put them to work, building and cleaning the city. And some were sent on farms, all under the supervision of Africans. The tables had been momentarily turned. They were released the following year after Italy paid millions in reparations to Ethiopia. Ethiopia remained the only African country not colonized by European power in the 19th century as a result of the victory. With the box office success of The Woman King, hopefully the studios will now finance similar productions instead of the past Tarzan Saves the Africans jungle narratives. Now, some of you know, I launched a Kickstarter to fund my graphic book, which is being illustrated by a brilliant young Ugandan architecture student and artist at Makerere University, which is in Uganda. I'm happy to announce that the campaign is nearing its goal. As of today, October 29, 2022, the campaign has raised $12,445, or 79% of the target, which is $15,750. I want to thank the 74 backers who've supported the project so far. At the same time, I also do want to mention that the campaign ends in a few hours after midnight of October 31st. So any support, of course, is still welcome to enable us to meet the target. 79% is good, but it's not quite 100%. And I'm sure many of you know the rules of Kickstarter. If you do not meet your target, all the money is sent back. It's refunded to the people that made the pledges. So while we've raised a substantial part of it, the remaining part could still be very decisive in terms of whether this project gets funded or not. So any support is welcome. And I'm going to include the link of the Kickstarter campaign after I finish my remarks. Otherwise, you can also go to kckstarter.com. And there you can search for Adwa, which is ADWA. And that's the location of that decisive and historic battle, the Battle of Adwa. So during the course of the other platform, I should now call it the other platform, because now I'm really made up my mind to create a separate platform for We Love African History. We've been discussing lately Amilcar Cabral and Walter Rodney. And doing the readings, we've been reading Unity and Struggle, highly recommended by Cabral. And we've also been reading this newly put out book, contains the works of Walter Rodney, Decolonial Marxism. It's just great. Some of the material is also actually from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but it also has a lot of original material of Rodney that I'd not yet read. So we've been discussing that in We Love African History. And as I'm thinking now, I would like to make a direct commentary similar to what I've been doing on this platform, discussing both Rodney and Amilcar Cabral together. So that is what I will do for my next commentary for African History Club. And hopefully I should be able to do that in the next week. And of course, I still have to produce African History Club as well, but I'm optimistic that I'll be able to do it. In any event, that will be my next commentary for African History Club. So as always, thank you for the support. We've been on this long journey together, and I hope that I have been able to share some aspects of African history that you find interesting, that you had not been exposed to or engaged in. So as always, remain Pan-African, stay blessed. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.